The form had 17 pages. Kate Mercer was on page 9 when the Voth ambassador began his 40th minute of speech about humanity's potential. She did not look up. She turned to page 10. The hall of the Galactic Council was built by beings with strong opinions about ceilings. The ceiling above her was 40 m high, curving inward at the edges in a way that pulled the eye upward whether it wanted to go there or not. The walls were pale mineral composite, lit from inside, and every surface reflected light back into the room at a slightly different angle, so the whole space glowed with a vague and sourceless significance. Kate had been here 11 times in 3 years. The room tried to make her feel small. Every single time she let it try, she had things to file. Page 11 asked for fleet composition by glass. She picked up her stylus and worked through it carefully. She was the kind of person who filled in every field, including the optional ones, because the forms were designed by someone who thought every field mattered, and she was inclined to give that person the benefit of the doubt. The chamber held 42 delegations. Most of them were watching Ambassador V, the Voth representative whose full name required specific equipment to pronounce. He had been speaking for 40 minutes about the noble promise of humanity's observer status and the great honor of their inclusion and the profound hope the Council held for their continued participation in the project of galactic peace. He had not mentioned the Nareth once, which told Kate everything she needed to know about the first 40 minutes of the speech. Leon Holt leaned in from the chair to her right. Should we be listening to this? I am listening, Kate said. You are on page 11. I can do 2 things. Leon sat back. He had been her aide for just over 2 years. In that time he had learned several things about Kate Mercer: that she finished everything she started, that she was never late, that she was always right, and that arguing with her while she was doing paperwork was an activity with no return on investment. He folded his hands and watched the ambassador speak. The Nareth situation had been building for 3 months. It started with a border monitoring station going offline. Not destroyed, not attacked, simply offline, reporting nothing, responding to no contact. That happens sometimes in deep space for reasons having nothing to do with aggression. The Council logged it and waited. Then a cargo corridor used by 4 species was quietly redirected with no announcement, no explanation, no authority cited. The ships using it simply found new coordinates in their updated navigation data one morning. Then a colony whirled in the outer Pelari territories received a message from the Nareth government. It was framed as a formal greeting. It included within its greeting structure a very detailed assessment of the colony's population, resources, and distance from Pelari defense installations. The Council convened emergency sessions twice. Both times the sessions produced resolutions urging continued dialogue and expressing collective concern. The resolutions were drafted, voted on, transmitted, and ignored. This time they wanted contributions. Every species with military capacity was asked to complete a contribution. Assessment form, ship classes, armament categories, deployment timelines, strategic reserve configurations. The assembled totals would form a unified response force. The theory was that the Nareth would see the combined number, calculate the cost of their current trajectory and choose a different one. Kate had received the form 4 days ago. She filled it out with the same care she brought to every official document. She checked the figures 3 times, one more than she usually checked anything, because she had a reasonable suspicion about what the form's intake system was built to handle. The system rejected her first submission of Section 7C with an automated response. Value exceeds input parameters. Please verify entry. She verified the entry. It was correct. She resubmitted with a short note attached, "This is not a typo." The system accepted the second submission and issued a confirmation receipt with one flag marked beside her entry. Value pending verification. She had turned back to page 12 and kept going. Now she was on page 15, and the ambassador was rapping toward his conclusion. She could tell because he had reached the part that used the word together in every other sentence, which was his rhetorical signal for a closing argument. Leon was watching the contribution display board at the front of the chamber where submission totals appeared in real time as delegations filed their forms. "The Dranki are in," he said quietly. 8 Dreadnoughts, 1,200 support vessels. Good. The Voth submitted 12 Dreadnoughts, 340 capital ships. I saw. Our submission just posted. Good. A pause. Kate. She was on page 16. The board stopped. She looked up. The display had frozen mid-update. Technician near the side of the chamber was at the control panel, moving quickly, with the focused expression of someone troubleshooting something they had not expected to troubleshoot. The board flickered, resumed, froze again. Then it loaded. Next to the human delegation's entry on the contribution board, a number appeared. The Draneki representative across the aisle turned his head. He read the number. He read it again. He did not look away from the board. Kate looked at it, checked it against her own tablet, found it accurate, and returned to page 16. Is that right? Leon said. His voice had gone quiet in the way of someone who was not sure what volume was appropriate for the situation. Yes. That is. Yes. Page 17 covered resolution protocols for ambiguous engagement scenarios. Kate found it the most interesting section of the whole document. By the time she signed the final page and set her stylus down, 4 delegations had stopped what they were doing and were looking at the board. The Voth ambassador had abandoned his conclusion entirely and was standing motionless near the Cellari section, staring at the number with the expression of a person who has measured a room 3 times and gotten 3 different answers and is beginning to suspect the room is the problem. Kate closed her tablet. She finished the last of her coffee cold. It tasted like the idea of coffee rather than the actual thing. She stood, straightened her jacket, nodded to Leon, and walked out of the hall of the Galactic Council with 17 completed pages and the clean, unremarkable calm of a person who had done exactly what was asked of them. Nothing extra, nothing missing. In the corridor outside, she sent one message to Earth Fleet Command. Form submitted. Expect contact within 48 hours. She was off by 45. The contact came in 3 hours. Administrator Valatoth called at 600 station time, which was either very Early by council standards or exactly on time by Voth standards, and Kate had long suspected the Voth did not recognize the distinction. She was eating eggs at the small table. In the human delegation's quarters, Leon was across from her with his morning briefing tablet. The comm chimed in. His eyebrows went up slightly when the caller identification came through. Valatoth was 312 years old. He had been straddling council processes since before humanity had figured out orbital mechanics. His carapace had gone translucent near the joints, and his eyes held the quality of very old, very precise instrument, slow to focus and impossible to fool. Kate had met him once at a formal reception. He had asked her 2 questions about Earth's southern hemisphere agricultural systems, and remembered both her answers 6 months later. He was not a person who asked questions he did not intend to use. He had never called her directly before. Ambassador Mercer, he said, his voice had the quality of a person choosing each word like stepping stones across a narrow stream. Administrator, she said, the council's administrative office has completed a preliminary review of your delegation's contribution submission. Good, she said. There appears to be a discrepancy. She took a sip of coffee. What kind? A numerical one. A pause long enough to be significant. The figure you entered in Section 7C appears to have exceeded the processing parameters of our intake system. Leon had put his tablet down. He was watching her face. What parameters are those? She said. The field was designed to accept values between 1 and 9,999 units. Your entry. He stopped. Start. Again, the system was unable to render it. The output field displayed a series of query symbols. I included a note with the resubmission, Kate said. It said the entry was not a typo. A silence, the kind that is wait. Yes, he said, we saw the note, which is why I am calling rather than issuing a correction request through standard channels. Could you provide the intended value verbally for the record? She told him, the same way she would tell someone a flight number or a street address, plainly without preamble. The silence that followed was different from the previous one. The previous one had been a person choosing words. This one was a person doing something else entirely, recalibrating something they had held as stable, adjusting an assumption that had been so long established they had stopped noticing it was an assumption. Then Valatoth said carefully, I want to confirm I understand your classification system correctly. By Dreadnought you mean? She walked him through it. She used the definitions from the form itself because those were the agreed terms. Class IV or above, minimum 4 km in length, armament sufficient for sustained planetary sea operations, independent logistics and resupply capacity, full operational autonomy for a minimum of 18 months. Yes, those ships, exactly those. And the figure you provided represents current active inventory, he said. As of last quarter's count, she said. Updated monthly, there is some variance, depending on maintenance rotation and construction schedules, but the figure is accurate to within approximately 300 units. Silence. 300 units of variance, he said slowly, like someone repeating the dimensions of a room they had just learned was much larger than the building containing it. Give or take, she said, the construction Rings operate on independent scheduling. He asked after a moment how many construction rings there were. She told him that too. The call went quiet long enough that she finished 2 more bites of eggs and drank half her coffee before he spoke. Again. Ambassador Mercer, he said at last, I will be routing your submission to the Security Committee for manual review. This is standard procedure for any entry that requires a system override. I want to assure you this is not a reflection of any concern regarding your delegation's conduct. I understand, Kate said. I would also note informally, he continued, that the other contributing delegations have submitted without incident and that your submission represents he paused, a significant point of discussion among my colleagues. I imagine it does, Kate said. She thanked him for calling. She set the calm down. Leon was looking at her with the expression he used when he had been presented with information that required several minutes of quiet processing before any response was possible. The Security Committee, he said. Yes. That is the full panel, 14 species. Admiral Shorvac chairs the Dreadnoughts. Zeta. I know. He is not historically a being who responds to unexpected information with warmth and open arms. He does not need to respond with warmth, Kate said. He needs to understand what he is looking at. Once he understands, his response will adjust. Accordingly, she pushed back from the table. That is the point. What followed in the next 24 hours, Kate learned mostly from Leon, who had cultivated a source in the VATH administrative office over the previous year on the sensible grounds that bureaucrats who like you will always share things that bureaucrats who do not like you will not. Velthoth routed the submission up to the VATH High Administrator with a note, flagging it for priority review. The High Administrator read it. He looked at the figure. He forwarded it to the Dreadnoughts military liaison attached to Council Security Operations, framing the forward as a courtesy cross-check. Standard practice when submissions deviated significantly from projected norms. The Dreadnoughts liaison read the number. He placed the document on his desk. He picked it up again. He read it again. He placed it down again. In the Dreadnoughts language, there is a word Velkorath which translates roughly as the feeling of reaching for something you believed was a wall and finding it was not. It implies a reorganization of understood space, a reclassification of the solid and permanent. The liaison used the word 4 times in the response message he sent back to the VATH High Administrator. The High Administrator forwarded the entire chain to Velthoth with a single added line, schedule the full committee. The formal request arrived in Kate's office, in-person clarification before the Security Committee at the human delegation's earliest convenience. She checked her schedule. Thursday was open. Velthoth's response came back in 11 minutes. Thursday was available for all committee members. The Grand Hall of Security Review, which had last been convened in full session 11 years ago for a territorial dispute between 2 established member species, was available Thursday. Everyone it appeared had cleared their Thursdays. Bring documentation, Velthoth added at the end of his message. Kate replied that she would bring the first 40 pages of the primary asset index. A pause before his response came back. The first 40 pages. The full index runs somewhat long, she said. We can discuss how the committee would like to handle the remainder once we are in session. She did not specify the full index's length. She sent Leon to the print office. He came back 30 minutes later looking like a man who had carried something heavier than expected, which was accurate because the 40-page preliminary brief and the separately bound index summary together came to just under 2 kg. Phil Drake came by that afternoon. Phil was the head of the full human diplomatic corps, a position he had held for 4 years, and he had the sustained, forward-leaning energy of a person who had spent 4 years staying ahead of fast-moving situations. He had heard about the security committee summons. He had also heard about the display board incident in the main council chamber because he arrived with the expression of a man who had been receiving briefings since early morning and was trying to determine how concerned to be. He stood in the doorway and said, "How concerned should I be?" "Not very," Kate said. "That is a different answer from not at all." "Yes," she agreed. He waited. "Thursday will be clarifying," she said. "For everyone." Phil looked at the documentation stack Leon had placed on the side table. He looked at the bound index. He looked back at Kate with the expression of a man who had asked a reasonable question and received a reasonable answer that somehow left him more unsettled than before. "Bring your own coffee," she said. "Council-synthesized drinks are a form of punishment." He stared at her. "Right," he said finally. "Thursday." "Thursday," she agreed. He left. Leon straightened the documentation stack. Kate reviewed her notes for the committee session, made 3 small additions, and decided the rest could wait for the morning. Outside the window of the delegation quarters, the council station turned in its slow and orderly rotation. Somewhere 2 light hours distant, nothing had happened yet. Thursday would be different. The Grand Hall of Security Review was smaller than the main council chamber. The ceiling was lower, the walls tighter, every dimension calibrated to communicate that whatever was discussed here was too serious to require a grand setting. Long tables arranged in a horseshoe shape with the human delegation seated at the open end, facing 14 delegations arranged in a curved row. 14 species, 23 officials, the Cellari representatives in environment suits, the regulators making a faint sound that never quite became background noise, the Dreadnought Admiral Shorvak standing at the far right of the arc. Dreadnought did not sit during sessions where their assessment of the situation was not yet settled. It was a cultural practice. Kate's briefing files described as readiness signaling. She noted it without comment. She placed the documentation package on the table in front of her. It made a solid, dense sound on the surface. Vale Toth, chairing from the center of the arc, looked at the documentation package with the careful attention of a being cataloging potential complications. He opened the session formally. Standard language about the purpose of clarification proceedings, the Council's commitment to treating all delegations with equal respect, the procedural basis for the committee's authority. 3 delegations requested the floor before he finished the opening statement. Kate let them go first. The Pelari representative spoke first. Their species communicated in a blend of speech and visible color shifts along the neck tissue, and the neck was currently in a range Kate associated with controlled concern. Perhaps, the representative suggested. Carefully, humanity used the term Dreadnought to describe vessels that other species would classify differently. Cross-species military taxonomy presented genuine translation challenges. It was possible there had been a classification inconsistency. Kate said the definitions she used were the form's own definitions. She had applied no broader interpretation. The Pelari neck shifted further into a yellow-orange range. A mid-tier counselor named Riva Seth, representing the Serendi, asked about the construction ring figure. 6 active rings. Were all 6 currently operational, or did that figure include rings under development or awaiting resource allocation? Kate said 6 active rings, all producing at current capacity. Riva Seth exchanged a short word with the delegate beside her, then looking back at Kate. And these rings are operating because we needed more ships, Kate said. The Chelari delegation, suits registered a temperature drop of approximately 6 degrees over the next 30 seconds. Kate had been in enough meetings with Chelari to know this was not a mechanical issue. Their internal temperature responses to information were involuntary and precise, which made them the most honest communicators in the room, even when they said nothing aloud. Shorvik had not spoken. He was still standing. The quality of his stillness was not patience. It was the specific, focused stillness of a military mind running calculations. When the other delegations finished their questions, he spoke. Ambassador Mercer, his voice was low and flat, built for large rooms. My delegation requests a live verification. Under Protocol 7, physical confirmation is required when any single submission exceeds standard projection thresholds by 20% or more. Your submission exceeds that threshold considerably. We invoke the protocol. Kate said, of course. A sample deployment, representative of the submitted figure, neutral. Coordinates confirmed by the chair. Agreed. His pale eyes held hers. A minimum of 10% of the submitted figure. Agreed, Kate said. She picked up her Veil Toth office in Shorvik's liaison confirmed coordinates in 4 minutes, a neutral deep space location. 2 light hours from the council station. On the primary long-range observation array. Clean, measurable. Kate made the call. Begin sample deployment. Coordinates as transmitted. 10% of Class IV assets in above standard formation. The observation feed came up on the wall display behind Veil Toth's position. The first FTL emergent signatures appeared on the feed like lights being switched on in a dark building, precise and organized, each one resolving from the brief blue-white flash of transition into the solid, enormous shape of a human dreadnought holding position. The scale indicator in the feed's lower corner adjusted once, then again, recalibrating for the actual dimensions of what it was now being asked to represent. The room watched. Kate watched the room. The Pelari representative leaned forward, not a deliberate movement, but the body responding to something the mind was still catching up to. The Serendi counselor beside them pressed both hands flat on the table. Surface, fingers spread as if verifying. The table was still there. The second wave arrived. More ships holding formation. The first wave adjusted slightly to accommodate them, the whole arrangement perfectly ordered, the kind of order that comes from either extraordinary training or extraordinary numbers, and in this case it was both. The third wave. Shorvik took one step toward the display screen and stopped himself. One step. His instincts had moved him before. His discipline caught up. He stood very still after that, but the step had happened and Kate had seen it, and she suspected he knew she had seen it. The Voth High Administrator was counting. Under his breath, she could not hear him, but she could see his lips moving. He counted for a while. He stopped at a number she could not identify. But the point at which he stopped counting suggested he had reached the boundary of what counting felt like an appropriate response to. The ships kept coming. Display system began to struggle. It had been built for fleet reviews of the kind the Galaxy had previously produced, designed for numbers that resolved into individual whole shapes at reasonable viewing distance. The more distant vessels began rendering as compressed light clusters, bright masses at the edge of the frame where the resolution of individual shapes was no longer possible. The system was doing everything it had been designed to do. It was not enough for what it was being asked to show. The count in the corner of the feed climbed. At 15,000, the Uvesh delegate who had been taking notes set his stylus down. At 28,000, one of Shorvik's aides seated in the row behind him made a sound that was not a word in any language Kate had been briefed on. It was the sound of a mind making a very rapid adjustment to a very large assumption. At 38,000, the Pelari neck tissue went a color Kate had no reference for in her briefing materials. She filed the observation for later. At 44,000, Rivasith leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a person doing mathematics they had not planned to do today. The count continued. At 51,000, the deployment completed. Kate's comm confirmed full arrival. Stable formation. She checked the figure against her briefing sheet, looked up at the committee. 51,412 vessels, she said. That represents 10% of Class IV assets and above, as requested under Protocol 7. The room absorbed this in the kind of silence that has actual physical weight. Shorvak turned from the display slowly. He turned like a person making sure their expression is fully under control. Before it becomes visible, he looked at Kate. 10%, he said. Yes, this is 10%. Of Class IV and above, she said. It does not include classes I through III. It does not include the Home System Reserve Fleet, which operates under a separate command structure and was not part of the contribution assessment calculation. I also want to be transparent. 6 deep space construction rings are currently in active operation, and their quarterly output will be reflected in the next assessment update. If the committee would like those production projection figures, I can have them to you by end of week. Nobody responded to the offer about projection figures. Kate picked up her coffee cup. She had brought it from the delegation quarters. She had not touched it since sitting down because she had been counting ships on the feed and had lost track somewhere above 30,000. She drank it cold. It tasted like the memory of what she had been thinking about when she made it. She drank it anyway. Valoth said, "The committee thanks the human delegation for cooperating with Protocol 7 verification. We will recess for 1 hour. A pause. There will be a full council inquiry session, not the Security Committee alone, the full 42 Delegation Council. The High Arbiter has confirmed availability Thursday of next week. I will be there, Kate said. Leon collected the documentation. Kate stood, nodded to the committee, nodded specifically to Shorvak, and walked out. The corridor was long and quiet. Leon fell in beside her, and they walked in silence for a while. 44,000, he said eventually. That was when the Pilari neck went a color I have never seen. I noticed. Do you know what that color means? I have a guess, she said. What is your guess? She thought about it. Something along the lines of the wall we thought was behind us was not a wall. Leon was quiet for a moment. That seems accurate. They walked the rest of the way without speaking. Through the tall windows at the end of the corridor, 2 light towers away, the feed was still running. 50,000 ships holding their positions in the dark, waiting for further instructions. They had been built to wait. They were good at it. The full council inquiry opened on a Tuesday morning, which Kate had always thought was an honest day of the week. Not the optimism of Monday, not the accelerating certainty of Wednesday. Tuesday was a day that knew it was in the middle of something and was not pretending otherwise. She arrived 7 minutes early. Leon was beside her. Greg Cole, the delegation's legal documentation specialist, was on her left with a folder containing the 4 pages of notes she had prepared, and nothing else. 42 delegations were seated. Seats that had been empty during the Security Committee demonstration were now all filled. Every delegation with access to the long-range observation feeds had seen the deployment record. Every delegation had been briefed. The room was as fully prepared as a room can be to ask a question whose answer it has already partially seen and still cannot fully process. Kate placed her folder on the table. She did not open it. She waited. The High Arbiter opened the session with standard inquiry language, the gathering of information, not the assignment of fault, the equal treatment of all delegations, the Council's commitment to transparent process, delivered neutrally professional. Kate had heard this language before in other sessions. Today it landed differently. The floor opened. The Voth ambassador went first. He was a different one from the ambassador who had given the 40-minute speech about humanity's potential 2 weeks earlier. This one was younger with a sharper delivery and had clearly spent time with his prepared remarks. He spoke for 22 minutes. His central argument was about the Council's collective security framework and something he called the principle of proportional contribution, which he framed as a foundational shared understanding between all member and observer species. No species, he argued, should unilaterally accumulate assets beyond what was necessary for their own defense without Council awareness and agreement. The phrase reasonable defensive necessity appeared 4 times in his statement. Kate had written it down the first time. She heard it 2 weeks ago. He it down again each time he used it. When the ambassador finished, Shorveg rose. He used no notes. He never used notes for formal proceedings. He delivered 11 minutes of precise, structured argument. No species builds significantly beyond sufficiency without a purpose. This was not an accusation. This was a statement of strategic logic that applied to every civilization capable of building anything at all. House is built to a size, a wall is built to a height, both reflect an intention. The question was not an attack on humanity's character. The question was simply, what is the purpose? The Cellari delegation submitted a written statement read aloud by the session recorder because the Cellari's natural communication mode was incompatible with council floor proceedings. The statement was 4 sentences. The Cellari found the situation deeply concerning. They were reviewing their understanding of the galaxy's actual distribution of military capacity. They would be reassessing their own defense posture in light of new information. They expected this reassessment would take some time. 4 sentences, each doing the work of a much longer document. The Pelari spoke, the Uvesh spoke, the Sarandel spoke. The combined picture from their statements was this: humanity had spent 11 years in observer status, quiet and participatory, filing forms, attending sessions, building consensus. Carefully, the way you build something you intend to keep. And the entire time it had been operating a military infrastructure that no one in the council had known to account for at a scale that the council's own administrative systems were not designed to hold, growing at a rate that had been invisible because no one had thought to ask. 3 delegations did not request speaking time but submitted written notes requesting further bilateral engagement with the human delegation. The formal language meant, we want to speak to you privately without the whole room watching about what this means for our arrangements. When the last delegation finished, the High Arbiter gave Kate the floor. She stood, she did not open her folder. I appreciate the time and the seriousness with which these concerns have been raised, she said. I am going to address the points that matter most and trust the committee to ask follow-up questions if anything requires clarification. She looked at the Voth ambassador. The phrase reasonable defensive necessity was used several times this morning. I wrote it down each time. It is a phrase that makes complete logical sense if your species has never reached the point where reasonable preparation was not enough. She paused for 2 seconds. We have reached that point more than once. Preparation we undertook afterward was reasonable to us. She looked at Shorvac. Admiral, Shorvac's argument is correct. No species builds past sufficiency without a purpose. Our purpose was this: we decided as a species that we would never again be caught without enough to defend every world we had settled, enough to hold every line we had drawn, enough that no one calculating a risk would ever look at us and decide we were an acceptable cost. She looked at the High Arbiter. We submitted the form you asked us to submit. We answered every question asked of us. We attended every session, filed every document, and cooperated with every procedural request that came to us. We were never asked about the fleet. She picked up her folder, did not open it, simply held it. We were not hiding, we were simply not broadcasting something we had not been asked about. She sat down. The room held the particular silence that follows something received but not yet fully sorted. Then Elder Mothvo raised one hand from the far left of the council arc. He was the oldest Voth in the chamber, possibly the oldest currently serving. council member of any species. His carapace had fully translucent near the joints, and the color of his eyes was a deep and settled amber, the kind you see in instruments that have been working correctly for a very long time. He had been alive when the vote to grant humanity observer status was taken. He had, according to historical records, proposed the original resolution language himself. The High Arbiter granted him the floor. Mothvo looked at Kate with the patient, unhurried attention of a being who had spent 3 centuries listening and had learned precisely when words were worth the effort. He said, "Were you planning to tell us?" The question was not accusatory. It held no performance of outrage. It was the question of a very old and very careful mind that had heard everything the session had produced and had decided that this was the one thing it actually needed to know. Kate held the question for a moment. She thought about the form, about page 17, about the note she had attached to the resubmission that said simply, "This is not a typo." "We submitted the form," she said. "We answered accurately. We never provided false information and never withheld information that was formally requested." She held his gaze. "We were simply never asked." Mothvo held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, small, slow, the nod of a person who has received an answer that is both complete and insufficient, and who understands exactly why it is both. "No," he said quietly, "I suppose you were not." The High Arbiter called a 2-hour recess. In the corridor outside, Phil Drake came alongside Kate and walked without speaking for almost a full minute. She let him find his own pace. 4 delegations sent formal treaty requests during the session, he said. Finally, while the inquiry was still open, "I have them queued. Add them to Greg's schedule," Kate said. "Kate," he stopped walking. She stopped with him. "The Dreadnoughts liaison contacted our office 30 minutes ago. A private meeting, not the committee, not a formal proceeding, specifically with you." "Schedule it," she said. "They also specified it should be off the record." "That is fine." Phil looked at her for a long moment. "You expected this?" "I thought it was likely," she said. "You thought they would respond to finding out about the fleet by wanting to make arrangements. I thought the ones who were afraid would be less afraid once they understood the situation clearly, and the ones who saw opportunity would move toward it." She started walking again. "Neither of those is a bad outcome." Phil kept pace in the Narath. She glanced at him. "The deployment record has been in the Council's public files for 6 days. Every member with long-range observation access has the data. The Narath have long-range observation access." She paused. "They are recalculating." Phil absorbed this, then more quietly, "How long were you building as a species?" "All of this from the beginning." Kate walked 3 more steps before she answered. "Long enough," she said. She did not say more. Phil did not ask. Again, behind them in the council chamber, 42 delegations were in recess, moving in small clusters, speaking in the urgent undertones of people updating their understanding of something that had seemed fixed and was no longer. In 2 days they would reconvene and formally confirm what the corridor conversations had already decided, that humanity was ready for full membership because humanity had quietly and without announcement been ready for a long time. 2 light hours away, the fleet held position. Patient. 6 months later, Kate Mercer had a different chair. The cushioning was roughly equivalent to the observer section she had used for 3 years, and the view from the third seat left of the high arbiter was less interesting than the view from the upper observer gallery. But the chair had a nameplate, a dedicated terminal, and the legal standing to vote on council resolutions, propose agenda items, and formally contest the proceedings of any other delegation. It was a full membership seat. Humanity had moved from the waiting room to the main table in 6 weeks. The vote had been 31 in favor, 6 abstentions, 5 opposed. The 5 opposed were all species with territorial interests adjacent to human aligned space. Their opposition was noted in the record, carefully processed and completely irrelevant to the outcome. The Nareth situation resolved faster than Kate had projected, which she noted in her personal log as a data point for future estimates. The visible presence of 50,000 human ships on a publicly available observation record proved to be a more efficient diplomatic instrument than any statement, resolution, or formal communique the Council had previously produced in its entire history. The Unified Response Force sent a message. It included, as a standard attachment, the verified contribution figures from all member species. The Nareth expansion halted within 48 hours. Their response called the decision voluntary. The Council accepted the language without comment and moved forward. There are moments in diplomacy when accuracy matters less than momentum, and all 42 delegations understood this without being told. Kate signed the response acknowledgement from her new seat and closed the file. She opened the next item in her queue, the 7th formal treaty consultation request she had received since the inquiry. The Pelari had sent theirs first within hours of the session, ending the Uvesh the following morning, the Oreth by end of day. Greg Cole had built a consultation schedule that now ran 4 months forward and was still expanding weekly. He maintained it with the focused patience of a person who had accepted that the map had changed and was committed to being accurate about the new geography. Leon, at his desk across the office, managed the formal membership documentation backlog. His workspace looked like a filing system that had undergone a significant disagreement with itself. He had not complained about this once, which was Kate's consistent measure of a good aide. The first private meeting with Shorvac happened 3 days after the inquiry, not the full committee, not a formal proceeding. 2 people, 1 aide each. A small conference room near the Dreadnoughts delegation section of the station. They reviewed a shared briefing document together for the first 30 minutes, without much conversation. Then Shorvac put the briefing document down. He said without any lead-in, "The Perseverance." Kate went completely still. She had not said the name in any session, any brief, any corridor conversation. The Dreadnought intelligence services were not the kind that announced themselves. "You lost 3,000 people," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "A logistics error. The resupply ship was given the wrong coordinates. By the time the discrepancy was identified, the timeline had closed." He looked at her steadily, and afterward, she said, "we made sure it could not happen to a whole world." A pause. "Or a whole species," he said. "Yes." The silence that followed was different from all the silences in the council chambers. Those had been political, calculating, full of people working out what information meant for their own positions. This one was the silence of two people from two different species, who had both, at different points in their histories, made the same decision, from the same place. The decision that grief of a certain kind does not get set aside or processed into something smaller. It gets built into something large enough that the same event cannot happen again. Then we understand each other, Shorvik said. They signed the preliminary defense framework 4 days later. Shorvik attended the signing in person, which he was not required to do for a document at that level. He signed it, looked at Kate, nodded once, a single, complete Dreadnought acknowledgement that carried the weight of a much longer statement, and walked out. The Chelari required more time. Their species communicated in ways that demanded patience from every other species around them, and their wariness about the situation ran deep enough that their first 4 formal communications to the human delegation were structured entirely as questions. Kate answered each one directly and without elaboration. Yes, the fleet exists at the scale you observed. Yes, the figures are accurate. No, the fleet is not oriented toward current council members. No, there is no intention to change that. The 5th communication was different. It came from the Chelari scientific community, not the diplomatic office. They wanted to understand the engineering principles behind operating multiple construction rings at continuous output. The question was academic in framing and entirely sincere in intent. Kate passed it to the appropriate department on Earth. They sent back a 43-page technical overview, not the full documentation, but enough to be useful. The 6th Chelari communication was a meeting request. Progress takes the shape it takes. You work with what you are given. Phil Drake stopped by her office on a Wednesday afternoon carrying 2 cups of coffee from the portable machine, which the council station's catering division had officially licensed to the human delegation after the Voth administrative office submitted a formal inquiry about broader availability. Kate had privately considered this the most concrete measure of humanity's new standing at the council, not the voting seat, not the treaty roster, but the coffee. Phil set a cup in front of her and sat across the desk. The Serendip wanted answer on the joint patrol proposal. Yes, with the 2 modifications Leon flagged. He has the file. The Pelari ambassador wants a meeting next week, Tuesday afternoon. The Nareth border monitoring resolution needs a human vote before Friday. It has one. Phil wrapped both hands around his cup. He looked at her with the expression he used when he had been holding a question for a while and had decided it was time. Can I ask you something personal? Probably not, she said, but you will. Anyway. He did anyway. Were you ever worried that it would go the wrong direction, that the council would respond to finding out about the fleet not with recalculation toward partnership, but with the other kind, the kind that ends badly? Kate looked at her coffee. Yes. But you submitted the form anyway. They asked for our military assets. We provided our military assets, she said. Her cup down. The alternative was providing false information on an official council document, and that was not something I was willing to do. But if it had gone wrong, She was quiet for a moment, outside the window, the council station's orbital array turned in its slow, reliable way. The same motion it had been making for decades, unconcerned with the conversations happening inside it. Then it would have been wrong, honestly. She said we were not going to misrepresent ourselves in order to be accepted. We built what we built. We are what we are. If the council could not work with the reality of that, it was better to know clearly and deal with it directly than to manage a misunderstanding for the next 50 years. Phil looked at his cup. He was quiet for a moment. 3 delegations sent you personal notes after the inquiry. I saw them in the communications log. They were personal. The UVASH representative wrote something about Phil, she said at once without edge. He stopped. The note said what people say when they discover they have not been alone in something they thought they were alone in. She said it was kind of them to write. I appreciated the thought. She did not say more than that. She did not explain what it is like to have spent 11 years being the smallest representative in a very large room, speaking for a species that had built something enormous and kept it unremarked, not from strategy, not from calculation, but from the simple understanding that the galaxy was not yet ready to know, and that when the galaxy finally learned, what mattered was not the reaction in the first hour, but what was built in the months that followed. Phil nodded slowly. He finished his coffee. He left. 2 weeks later, he was back, this time without coffee and with a printout in his hand. He set it on her desk. The quarterly fleet count, he said. Yes. It is higher than last quarter. Yes. The construction rings. 2 hit milestone output ahead of schedule, Kate said. A third is being expanded to handle support vessel production under the new bilateral framework commitments. The frameworks require capacity. We build to what we need. Phil looked at the printout for a moment. Then, will it ever be enough? The number, will there ever be a point where it is enough and the building stops? Kate looked at him steadily. When there is nothing left in the galaxy that requires us to be ready, she said, we will have that conversation. Phil looked at the ceiling briefly. Then he picked up the printout and walked out without another word. On Kate's desk, in a simple frame that Leon had placed there the week they moved into the new office, calling it a historical artifact which was accurate, was a printout of the original contribution form confirmation receipt. 1 page, header information submission. Timestamp, a row of field entries, each one confirming a successfully accepted value. Section 7C, military assets, in the value output field where the Council's intake system had attempted to render the figure she submitted and found it could not. There was a row of question marks. She looked at it sometimes, not with pride and not with the particular brightness of someone who has won something. She looked at it the way you look at a photograph of a place that no longer exists in the form you knew it, with something complicated and specific that does not reduce to a single word. She thought about the word approximate in the original form language, as if any figure she submitted would be an estimate, a rounding, a number to be refined later by someone who understood numbers better. She thought about 3,000 names on a memorial database that most people accessed once, if at all. She thought about the way grief moves Through a species, how it does not stay. In the people who knew the people who were lost, it spreads outward, it moves. Through policy decisions and allocation, priorities and late-night debates about force structure, and slowly over years becomes something else entirely. It becomes preparation. It becomes the thing you build so that when the coordinates go wrong again, when the clerical error happens again, when someone makes a decision at a desk, in a building that costs people on the other end of the distance, there is enough of everything else to compensate. You build ahead of it. You keep building. You build until the number is too large for the form's field to hold. Then you build some more. Leon appeared in the doorway. The Orith ambassador is here for the 400. Send them in. They brought a full delegation, 7 members. That is fine. They also brought something with them, a physical object quite large. Kate raised her eyebrows slightly. A model, Leon said, a hand-built scale. Model of one of our class IV vessels. The lead artisan worked on it for the past 6 months since the deployment. Demonstration, their cultural tradition of physical model building is considered a significant gesture of formal respect. According to their cultural attaché, it signifies that the builders spent sustained and careful attention on the thing being represented. It is how the Orith say in physical terms that something is worth understanding. Kate looked at him for a moment. 6 months from the morning 50,000 ships had come out of FTL on a public observation feed, and a species from 3 spiral arms away had seen what humans had quietly assembled in the spaces between stars, and it decided that the right response, the honest and meaningful response, was to spend half a year making something with their hands that captured even a fraction of it. Tell them I will be right out, she said. She stood, straightened her jacket, looked for a moment at the framed receipt on her desk, the question marks, where a number had been, a system that was not built to hold what was there. She thought about what gets built in the space between 2 things, the thing you were afraid of and the thing you decided to be instead. She thought about all the years between that ship and this office, between the observer gallery and this chair, between the question marks on the form and the number that had finally answered itself in the simplest possible way. She thought about the Orith artisan who had spent 6 months looking closely at something they had never seen before and deciding it was worth understanding. She turned off her desk lamp, walked out to meet the Orith delegation and the model they had carried across a station corridor to say, in the language of time and craft and careful attention, we see what you built and we understand now why you built it, and we would like to be something to each other. Outside, 2 light hours away, the fleet held formation in the dark between systems, steady, patient, present in the way that only things built from a long and deliberate refusal to be cut short can be present, not threatening, not aggressive, not performing anything for anyone. Just there, the way a foundation holds, the way a wall stands when a wall is what you need, the way a species holds when it has learned at great cost and from a young age exactly what it means to build ahead of everything it is afraid of, and has decided that it will keep building for as long as anything in the universe gives it reason to. The ships waited. They were not in a hurry. They had been built that way and built well, and they would hold for as long as they were needed, which the people who May them had always understood would be a very long time.